Welcome to everybody here. Really excited to be in this space with you today. This is our very first event here. So it's a big deal. My name is Veronica Santiago Liu, she, her pronouns, and I'm the founder and general coordinator of Word Up Community Bookshop and the co-founder of Recirculation, the space here today, which was started in part to honor the memory and the wishes of Tom Burgess, a friend who passed away from COVID-19 in June 2020. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Word Up and about Recirculation, but first I wanted to get a sense of who has been to Word Up before. Show of hands. And who's been to Recirculation? Okay. I also want to acknowledge that even though I'm talking about it as this being the first event in this new space, I want to acknowledge that this is the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced 400 years ago, and that this space, this building, this city, is on the land that they rightfully steward. So, Word Up Community Bookshop. We're a bookshop and art space. We're located Amsterdam on 165th Street at the moment, and we are not moving from there, even though this event is here. It started a little over 10 years ago, also as a pop-up shop. It was supposed to just be around for 1 month, but there was so much community support for the space that people were pushing to have extension after extension. We ended up there for a little over a year. And we're at the location we're at now and have been there since 2013. And that whole time, continuing to this day, we've operated as best we can as a collective of neighbors from Washington Heights, Inwood, Harlem, the Bronx. And we, anchored by the books and by the stories in books and the information in books, our aim is really to do the best we can by and for the community. So whatever other resources can be coupled along with the books or that will help all of us be able to take in that information with books, we'll do. So besides, book events and the other kinds of arts events we do there, we've also been a census pop-up, and collective members have trained to be able to administer the census. We've also, some of us have also done COVID-19 test training so that we've been a COVID test site there. And at the moment we host the People's Fridge, which is on the sidewalk right outside Word Up. And that, anyone is free to use and to leave food, to take food. And one of the other, pandemic era initiatives was the making of this space. So as I mentioned, Tom Burgess was a friend, but he also was a longtime volunteer at Word Up, our first 4 years. He was there sometimes daily, and he was a very avid collector of books and records. He loved that media. He loved, books and records, but it wasn't the only reason. He also had experienced a lot of scarcity in his life and with the people he worked with, and he wanted to make sure that the things that are readily available in the world and that in our communities, just with that that time and patience taken to reallocate, that people can get what they need. So when he called the night before, or when he called after he'd been hospitalized, the night right before he went on a ventilator, he called me to let me know where his storage units were, where his stuff was, just in case he was incapacitated coming out. He never left the hospital, and since that time, we've had many, many rounds of Word Up volunteers and friends empty out his apartment and his storage units, and we slowly started bringing things here. And to really, in the spirit of what Tom, was also doing, everything here, for the most part, is pay what you can. There are some books that came over from the Word Up location that are in our system that are new prices, but the 99% of things here are pay what you can. And we soon will be we're starting to accept donations from other community members too, to really recirculate what's here. But we invite you to, if you have an organization or if you're a classroom, a school, anything yourselves, if you need books for any kind of library you're setting up, any kind of project, use us as a resource. Use us, not just Word Up, but also this space in whatever ways you can. And we hope then to continue to recirculate the books, the space, all the resources in the community. I went really long with that introduction to this space. And I know that you are really here for this very, very special event with Akwaeke. And Memphis Washington will be introducing the event and Akwaeke shortly. And I have the pleasure of introducing Memphis. Memphis Washington came to Word Up as a volunteer on the eve of their 16th birthday. And since then has contributed so much to the collective, to all of us as individuals, as friends, but also to the organization as a whole, really, pushing us to think about things and perspectives and in ways that I think really both reflect what we've always wanted to do and be and have done at Word Up, but also beyond what we can do. The first program that they initiated was the Q&T meetup 5-6 years ago, and it continues to this day as a writing group. They also helped co-programmed Uptown Kidlit, the big festival we had in Inwood Hill Park in 2019. And then during the pandemic last year, when there was a sudden need for a lot of programming for kids with spaces closed, they oversaw a lot of our online programs that are the arts camp, like 7 different simultaneous art camp online, and then the whole round of after-school programming that we had for different age groups, including the Lomas Lit Book Club, which they helped sort of administer and then now are facilitating, and which we've done for several seasons. And new book clubs too. There's an internal collective book club, and they facilitated one of the books that we did, and then also started the Blickety Black Book Club. All of these things are programs that are either ongoing basis are available through Word Up, or if you really want to see them continue, bug Memphis. Although Memphis is also busy because Memphis is a student and works in books in other places as well. I am going to curb it here, but could keep going on about Memphis, but I'll let Memphis now take over and introduce the event. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many faces. It's been a while since we've done anything in person, and as Vern said, this is the first event we've had in this space, so thank you for inaugurating this capacity of recirculation. All right, we're going to start with a reading. We're going to have a little bit of discussion, not too much, okay? And then we're going to go into Q&A, where everyone can offer their questions. And then we'll have a signing. And we're all brought here today by Akwaeke Emezi's work. Akwaeke is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Death of Vivek Oji. Shout out to that book. That was a great pandemic read for me. Which was the finalist for the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Penn Gene Stein Award, okay? PET, which precedes Bitter, which we're celebrating today, which was a finalist for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, a Walter Honor Book, and a Stonewall Honor Book. Should have won, okay. Freshwater, which was named a New York Times notable book and shortlisted for the Penn Hemingway Award and all other sorts of awards. We're not going to do all that today. But also one of the things that's really exciting about this year, 2022, is that so many of their books and of different kinds, let's talk about the genres, let's talk about the range, okay? We have Bitter, which came out last Tuesday. We have a debut poetry collection coming out this year, Content Warning, and a debut romance novel for all the people who love falling in love. You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. Okay, so these are all things to look forward to this year. Akwaeke was selected a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation and featured on a Time magazine cover as the next generation leader. So listen closely. They are based in liminal spaces, and they're now going to join us to read.
Sorry, I just saw that display. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. It is an absolute pleasure to be back home in New York. New York is the first place that felt like home since I immigrated to the United States. It's also the first place where I lived because I was living here, not because I was going to school like the good little overachieving immigrant's child. Today I'm going to read from Bitter. How many people have read Pet? Yay. Okay. How many people have read Bitter? All right. Came out like 4 days ago. That's fine. So I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers, but the scene I'm reading from is where Bitter is on a date with Aloe. If you've read Pet, you know who Aloe is. And Bitter is from a fictional Caribbean island. A lot of her dialogue is in dialect. I'm not going to try and replicate that in this reading because the audiobook narrator did a better job. And I'm just going to read for what she's saying instead of trying to, put on an accent that I don't have. 2 hours later, Bitter and Aloe had run through what felt like half the cafe's supply of iced hibiscus tea. She had told him how Asata thought Eucalyptus kids didn't give a fuck about what was happening in Lucille, and how pointless she thought all the protests were. The mayor don't care, She broke a piece of fruitcake with her fingers, watching the raisins tumble to the plate. Only thing that happens is more and more people keep getting hurt, keep dying. Someone said after the shootout last year, they didn't even return the bodies to their families, just threw them into a grave together. A spasm of pain crossed Aloe's face at that, but he watched her thoughtfully. "What do you think they should do?" he asked. Bitter looked up. "Who?" He shrugged. "Anyone. Everyone. Instead of fighting, what else should they do to change things?" She laughed and looked away. He didn't want to hear the answer to that question. No one ever wanted to hear the answer to that question. "I'm serious," he continued. "I want to know what you think." "Fine, then. There's nothing to do," Bitter snapped, her voice heavy. She didn't want to look at him. "Everyone keeps fighting and fighting, one generation after another, and nothing changes. If you're born lucky, then you live lucky. Otherwise..." She let her voice trail off because it had nowhere to go. "It is what it is." Saying the words made Bitter feel like a dark cloud had hugged her, wrapping her in soft, thick gray, numbing her skin. She pulled her knees up on the sofa and picked at the ring in her lip, circling it around. Aloe probably wasn't going to like her now, but that didn't matter. None of this mattered. None of this was real. Her little spiral was interrupted by the sound of Aloe chuckling softly to himself. Bitter glared at him. "What's so funny?" If he was laughing at her, she was going to punch him in the face. Aloe leaned forward and took her hand, the warmth of his palm surprising her. His eyes were gentle. No, nothing is funny," he said, even as he smiled. I don't believe you." "Excuse me?" He squeezed her hand and a small thrill rushed over Bitter's skin. She ignored it, holding her breath as Aloe kept talking, his words tripping over each other in their animation. "I don't believe that you think nothing can change. You're an artist. You imagine things all the time, and you're trying to tell me that you can't imagine anything different from this, another kind of world, that you've never imagined something better than what's happening now?" Bitter exhaled softly and pulled her hand away. Another world. She bit the inside of her lip as a traitorous memory crept up on her, smelling like ash and blood and salt. There had been one photograph. One photograph of the woman who shared Bitter's hard cheekbones and bare eyebrows, the same wide mouth. Her mother, trapped in an image forever, before she'd met the monster that would make her daughter, before Bitter was even born. Her last guardians had given it to Bitter when she was much younger, in a rare moment of kindness. So at least you could know what she looked like, the woman had said, since you can't remember. Well, Bitter would never forget, not after she drew her mother over and over again, forming the lines of her face until they were perfect, her tall figure with the graceful dress. She'd practiced until it was flawless. Then Bitter had cut herself to wake the drawing up, dabbing her blood on her mother's face, on her sleeves, her neck, her hands. She tried it so many times until people started noticing her cut-up arms, and the woman she lived with pulled her aside and warned her to stop whatever nonsense she was doing because they weren't doing anything to her and she was walking around making them look bad. Bitter kept trying, hid the cuts better, but one day as she was sobbing over a splattered drawing, she realized it was never going to work. Her mother was never going to come back to life, and that was never going to change. That was never going to be different. She had burned the photograph then. It wasn't real, and it didn't matter. Her mother's face met her every morning in the mirror, and besides, Bitter's muscles couldn't forget how to draw her, even if she tried to wash the memory away. Aloe was staring at her. "Don't you imagine something better?" he was asking. "Ever?" Bitter stared back at him. "I used to," she said. "I stopped." "Why?" His face was urgent. His voice was urgent. His face sharpened in intensity. "You live in Eucalyptus. I'm sure that's better than wherever you came from. Things changed for you, Bitter. They changed for me. The fact that we're sitting here proves it. Why can't you believe that they can change for Lucille too?" "Why is it so important to you?" she shot back. "What I believe, what I don't believe. You recruiting for a SATA now or what?" "No, all you does like to say the same damn thing over and over. Change, believe, something better. What if there's nothing better? What if you keep feeding people this hope that's going nowhere?" Aloe took her hand again, grabbing it so hard that the bones pressed against each other. "Hope is what we need," he said. "Hope is what got me out of my father's house, what helped me keep going. Don't you want to keep going?" Tears built behind Bitter's eyes, flooding her head. "No," she whispered, shocked to hear the truth leave her mouth. "No, I want to stop. I want it to stop. I want everything to stop." She was crying now, and this is why she didn't like talking about these things, why she walked away and drew something real instead, because now that she had started, she couldn't make herself stop, any more than she could make the world stop. It hurts all the time, and I can't feel it. I can't let myself feel it, because then I will break into so many pieces you could never find enough of me to put me back together. How can you expect me to go fight, to be out there facing these people who don't care if we're alive or if we're dead? They are killing us all the time, and it is a game to them. All we are doing is throwing more and more of us into their damn teeth. For what? For hope? She sniffled and dragged the sleeve of her sweatshirt across her face, swiping roughly at her eyes and nose. Aloe had let go of her hand, but he was still listening intently, his eyes soft. "Hope is a waste of fucking time," Bitter said. "It doesn't matter if we're at the school. You know how many kids they never find? How many girls like me just disappear because someone's selling them? It's like we got a life jacket, and then you still know there's people out there drowning, and you're just sitting on a boat, watching them drown, and you remember what the drowning was like, but you can't bring yourself to go back." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. We can't make all of us safe, and unless all of us are safe, none of us are safe." Bitter grabbed a napkin and blew her nose loudly, not caring how she looked in front of Aloe anymore. This date was already a disaster. She just wanted to go back to Eucalyptus, put on her headphones, and lie in bed listening to something loud enough to erase all these feelings she'd thrown up in front of this guy. "Hey." Aloe touched her wrist lightly, and Bitter looked up to see him staring at her, his own eyes damp. "Can I give you a hug?" he asked, his voice tentative. Please? She was so surprised that he was crying, all she could do was nod, and then Abreu was wrapping his arms around her, swallowing her up in his wingspan, in his broad shoulders and chest, anchoring her. Bitter felt her heart wrench. He was hugging her like he needed to be held too, so she slid her arms around his ribs, smelling the lemon of his shirt, his back wide under her hands. Tension clicked free inside her, loosening her muscles, and she let out a jagged breath against his neck. "You're not alone," Abreu whispered. "I know how impossible it feels. I know it hurts. You don't have to feel any of this alone, Bitter." He released her, and Bitter wiped at her eyes again, not sure if she could believe him. "And hope is not a waste of time. Hope is a discipline." Abreu said the words with such complete confidence, with such a backbone of faith, that this time Bitter let them seep into her, just enough to register. She knew about discipline from her work. She knew about rigor and how you had to practice and practice and practice until you carried it with you in your bones. She'd never thought of hope like that as something serious and deliberate, instead of something wishful and desperate. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. The words had sounded too old for his mouth. Abreu broke into a grin. "Mariam Kaba," he said, "an organizer who fights for prisons to be abolished. Asata taught it to me. She's been one of their elders now."
Thank you for reading that chapter. That was the first chapter that made me tear up in reading it. So I think the first thing that I was thinking about when I was looking at the new book was wondering why you decided to go back in time, and what you were hoping for in doing that.
So originally, all the books in Lucille were meant to be a trilogy. When I started writing YA, I was like, okay, I'm going to write a YA trilogy, and then it can all be adapted into movies, and then we'll have a movie trilogy. And it seemed like, a very straight line. And when I started writing Pet, it was the first book I wrote where the story is linear and in chronological order, which is really hard for me to write. And there were all these little questions in there about the world before. There's a scene in Pet where the creature that Jam, who's the protagonist, the creature that she's pulled out of her mom's canvas, shows up and walks into her parents' bedroom. And she's terrified because she thinks her parents are about to be pissed. And instead, her parents look at it and they go, "Oh no, not again." And she's like, "Again?" And there's just no context given in the rest of the book for why that happened. And that's just how Pet wanted to be written. So I knew while writing it that I was going to have to go back and kind of explain what the city of Lucille was before it became what it is in the book Pet. The books are set about 25 years apart. So in Pet, the main character is Jam. Her mom is Bitter. And then we go 25 years back to when Bitter was a teenager for the book Bitter.
And so I think there's something that naturally makes a lot of sense about focusing on her mother. But there are a lot of characters in Bitter that we know from Pet, that and you choose to focus on them to varying degrees. I was wondering why you chose to hone in so closely on Bitter and Abreu, and as you were developing, I feel like, is it a spoiler to talk about Asada and what's happening there?
I don't think so, because they come in in the first chapter.
Yeah.
So.
And how you were constructing Asada and relating those characters to each other and building those relationships that we then see playing out in Pet.
Sure. For people who haven't read either of the books, Pet is set also in the city of Lucille, but in that world, they live in a community in which everyone says, there are no monsters anymore. There are no prisons. There are no police. everyone is happy and living their best lives. And there are a lot of adults in that book who are teenagers in this book. And in this book, it's the same city, but it's in the middle of a revolution, so to speak. You can relate it a little more to the world that we live in now, but there's a lot of state violence, there's a lot of chaos, and Bitter's stuck in the middle of that. And as you can tell from the excerpt, not very happy about it, and really having a hard time with despair and thinking that a better world is possible. She goes to a school called Eucalyptus, which is a boarding school for young artists. And so you have the kids from Eucalyptus, and then you have Asata, which is this revolutionary group. And so it's like the kids who are on the front line, the kids who are organizing protests. And there's a lot of tension between like these two groups of kids. And I wanted to write about that because I feel like young people of all ages, honestly, were dealing, especially in the last couple of years, we're dealing with a kind of guilt around what everyone's role was. And I was like, well, if you're really about that life, you should be out there, being about that life. And there was a lot of dismissal of other roles that people play. And there are all these like really tense conversations about what the people need and what is more important and what will get us, closer to liberation, so to speak. And that's, I guess, one of the things that I wanted this book to kind of address, is that tension and those conversations.
Yeah, I think it does it really well. One of the things that I find interesting is that from page to page, you don't really deal in metaphor, but overall, you deal in really large metaphors. And we start kind of on a micro scale with Pat, and then we're now dealing with things that feel much grander, and why, maybe thinking about how then these metaphors have changed for you in the process of writing Bitter. This idea of angels, this idea of monsters, or were they always this way? Were these always, we have angels and monsters, we have artists and politicians, and we have activists, and I think, and they're treated in these different ways, and you're talking about roles, and I'm just wondering how these metaphors sort of change as you start reading Bitter. Is that making sense?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that, just because, well, first of all, I think the idea of them as metaphors is a new one for me.
Oh, okay.
The angels in both these books are literal angels. So there's a conversation that Bitter, as an adult, has with her daughter Jam, and Jam is, growing up in like the like perfect version of Lucille, and Jam is trying to figure out the difference between angels and monsters, and what does an angel look like, because in that post-revolution like version of Lucille, the kids who in this book who like spearheaded the revolution, or like were big parts of this like turning point, the community calls them angels now. And so they're known as like the angels of Lucille. And then Jam is coming across like these ideas of like the biblical depiction of angels. And so she ends up having this conversation with her mother, Bitter, about appearances, about angels looking terrifying and monsters not looking like anything. And I think that's something that maybe is present a bit more in Pet than in Bitter, because in Bitter the angels are very literal, and in Pet they are, like, well, these are the people, these are the people we look up to, these are the people who got liberation for us, and yes, I think the concepts are just weighted a little differently in each book. So
one of the things, so much of the troubles in this story kind of come from the interpersonal struggles are about honesty. There's this conversation around honesty and truth and transparency, maybe as three different things, but working together. What about that theme resonates for you? Because I'm seeing it in both worlds play out on a very small scale, but also in terms of then the decisions that people are making for the world around. Try not to spoil this. Well, suffice it to say that there is something about honesty and transparency and truth in the interpersonal relationships with your characters between Bitter and Aloe, between Asata and the world, between Miss Virtue and the kids, and the Eucalyptus kids. And so what about that was important to highlight? So it comes up a few times, and there are these tense moments between the characters when they're like, I don't know if I can trust you, or what trust is based upon in this world.
That is really hard to answer without giving spoilers. I just think it's a huge part of like any interpersonal relationship, right? It's like that's where a lot of tension is going to be, whether you're organizing together, whether like Ms. Virtue is the woman who runs Eucalyptus, the boarding school, whether this is somebody who's an authority figure who you turn to for counsel, whether it's a romantic relationship between Bitter and Aloe. Fundamentally, we're always, I think, asking these questions. Am I safe with you? Can I trust you? Will you tell me the truth?
Okay, so if there was a character that you could have brought back or could have introduced in this book, because I think there's something kind of spare about your storytelling. You kind of stick to, I find when I'm reading at least your YA books, it's like whatever's emotionally necessary is kind of what's in there. What's some stuff that maybe you had to cut?
I had to decide like which characters from Pet I wasn't going to bring back, or which ones I would just like let people meet in Pet, and it's also in doing like a prequel that's set 25 years, but writing it after the first book, it's like it like messes with the timeline in my head, at least like a little bit, because then I'm trying to remember the personalities of them as adults and what did I write about them in Pet, about their childhoods, so I make sure that there's there isn't a continuity issue, and so I tried to pick characters that were kind of easier to track a little bit. But also, to be honest, like one of the things was when I started writing about Bitter, and she's a foster kid, and part of that is because I started writing about her and I was like, oh, well, damn, you can't have any parents. Because if you did, Jam would have had grandparents. And I didn't give Jam grandparents. So now I was like, I guess... I was like, how am I going to answer? Where did your grandparents go? Why did your mom never talk about her parents? And I kind of like worked myself into a corner with that. So in some ways, that's... those were things that I had to quite literally leave out because it wouldn't have tracked with Pets. Sometimes creative parts of books just come from like logistical problems like that.
Well, thank you. And
thank you.
How are we doing this? Maybe if you have a question, raise your hand and then we'll call on you and then I'll repeat the question so everyone hears. And then... All right. Who has a question? Correct me if I'm wrong about this. The first question having to do with fear. What's your relationship with fear? And what about the process of overcoming fear? Oh, Lord. I was so confident going into it. I'll repeat it. The fear that your characters are encountering and overcoming, what was it like sort of imagining that and coming up with that process? And then the second question being
I could, yeah. Like being comfortable with the cost of things, essentially, like how did you get there? What's your relationship with that also? I'm so sorry. I thought I dropped my phone and
So fear, one of the things that I strongly believe about fear is that, and I talk about this with my friends all the time, because we make a lot of decisions just trying to figure out how to step into our true selves. And, especially for like Black queer people, Black trans people who come from, African families, Caribbean families, like there's a lot of fear there, and there's a lot of costs as well. People who are, artists who are trying to make a sustainable living. These are all the categories my friends fall into. And we're trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we do what we love? How do we be who we are? How do we deal with the fear that comes from being entities like ourselves, moving through a world as cruel as this, where sometimes the cruelty is embodied by those who are closest to us? And one of the things I always say is that I think sometimes people think that being brave or having courage means that you don't feel fear. I suppose like a literal like fearlessness. And that's not the case in my experience, is that you feel fear and you do the thing anyway. And I think some people wait and think, well, if I don't feel the fear, then I know I'm ready. And I'm like, oh no, honey, the fear is going to be there. You figure out how to do the thing even while afraid. Because for me, one of the things I'm careful about is to not move with fear at my center. So it can be there, but it can't be at the center. I can't make decisions from fear. It can be kind of at the side, and I'm like, I hear you, I acknowledge you, I'm going to ignore you. And that's because I think that moving with fear at the center often immobilizes people. Like the fear takes over, it seeps into everything, it like gets into your bones, and you just can't. And moving it to the side is something that helps to move forward. Because often, well, not often, but in some cases, the things that need to be done are not as big as the fear makes them seem. It's like, apply for the residency. It's an application, you turn it in, and that's that. Logically, it's a 1, 2, 3 step thing. And then fear can kind of balloon it out into something bigger. Well, what happens if I get it? What happens if I don't get it? And everything just kind of snowballs into that. And I think that also leaning on community and whoever your chosen family are to help talk down the fear. Because fear is a story. Right? Like it's feeding us a particular story about something. And in order to counteract a story, you need another story. You need a better story, a stronger story, or a story with more hope, a story with more possibility. And those kind of stories can be amplified by the other people in your life so that you're not the only one telling it. And so that story eventually gets enough volume to drown out the story that the fear is telling. And, with costs, I think that was something that I figured out pretty early. I was very much like the precocious immigrant kid. Like I went to college at 16. I got my first degree at 19. I was always the youngest everywhere. My parents loved that shit. And they were like, oh my God, look, our little genius child. I hated it so much. And so I learned very early on that there was a cost to living up to my parents' idea of me. That cost was my mental health. And then when I stopped doing that, I learned that there was also a cost to disappointing them. And watching them turn from, being really proud and encouraging to really trying to tear me down and say that I was going to fail and I was afraid and I was in a dark, sick place. And you're just like, oh, wow, all of this just depends on, if I'm doing what you want or not. And I think eventually the decisions I started making were around And I think this is something that like the characters also kind of walk through in all my books, is you decide, if I'm going to pay a cost either way, you know, at least let me pay the cost for the life that I want. Because you'll be paying it either way. And once you figure out the fear parts of it, you know, we see Bitter in that conversation with Aloe from the excerpts. You can see already how he's giving her a story that's stronger than the story of her fear. And it's relating to her in ways that she can understand around discipline. And from there, she's going to be able to make different choices. She's going to be able to like craft a life. And they're going to be costs either way. But yeah, I think you figure out the life you want, and usually I find that it is worth the cost. Not immediately, but over time.
Okay, what is your favorite genre to write in, and what genre do you find most challenging?
So my favorite genre to write in is actually one I haven't published in yet, technically. It's adult fantasy. So fantasy was like my first love as a kid. I started writing my fantasy novel when I was 14 on like this giant clunky desktop computer we had like back at home in Nigeria. And then like I came to the States and I had my little story on a little floppy disk. And then the floppy disk got corrupted and I was like, no, my story. And all I had was like this little notebook that at this point I've had for like over 20 years. And I'm still writing actually the story. It's just changed a lot because I didn't grow up with a lot of like black fantasy. It was mostly like, you know, the Chronicles of Narnia. And then now there's just so much like black and brown fantasy, and I'm like, yes. And it's allowed me to expand my own imagination around like what's possible in fantasy. I know that like technically like Pet and Bitter like are considered fantasy, but to me the worlds they're in are like you can relate it to this world. So I'm like, no, I'm talking about magic. I'm talking about quests and kingdoms. And I meant to get around to it sooner, and the reason why I didn't start writing in fantasy when I started my career was that I'm a really like big publishing strategy person, just because I feel like I had to be, you know. When I was like a baby Nigerian writer, you study everything. You study the patterns of all the writers, and you notice that a lot of the African writers who were successful, aka actually able to make a living from their work, had gone to Ivies, or you know, had MFAs, and you know, were published in the journals and things like that. I wasn't. I didn't get published. Like none of my short form work got published in the US until after Freshwater came out. So all my short stories, stuff like that, they were all published in the UK because, you know, colonialism, we're benevolent to our African writers. And so when I decided to kind of go into publishing and publish the books, it was actually Binyavanga Wainana who gave me a lot of advice about that, because he read the manuscript for Freshwater, and you know, he's late now. We weren't close when he passed because he had turned out to be kind of problematic and things, so I no longer had a relationship with him at that time. But when we first met, he was the one who introduced me to my agent, and I was actually represented by a smaller agency in the UK, and he was like, no. He was like, you know, the entire publishing industry in the UK is smaller than the state of California. You need a New York agent. These are the agents I think would be a good fit for you. I'm going to send your manuscript to them. And immediately was just like, this is how you give yourself a fighting chance in this industry. And it is not lost on me that it took a queer African writer to do that for me. Because there were many opportunities for other African writers who were in mentorship positions to do that, and they did not. And it was Binyavanga who did, and that's something that I try to like pay forward a lot, because, you know, honestly, you can be the most talented writer. Merit is not going to necessarily get you an agent. It's not really going to teach you how to navigate a lot of this industry. And one of the strategies that I had was that I knew that, especially as an African writer, if I started in fantasy, it would be really, really hard for me to get out of it. It would be really hard for me to ever write anything else and get that published. So I was like, well, in publishing, what do they consider, dropping in from the top? Literary fiction. Cool, I'll do that. And so I did literary fiction first. And then I went into YA because I was broke. It was like a few months before Freshwater came out, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's looking great." Like, my team was so excited, and I was like, "That's cool." I don't have rent for the month that Freshwater is scheduled to come out in, so how does that help me? And I was offered a YA book deal. And I had been offered it before, and I said, no, I don't write YA. I have no time for it. And then I went back, and I was like, so that YA book deal that y'all were talking about, how quickly would I get in advance? And that's what led to the Lucille books. And then I wrote the memoir because it kind of inserted itself into the timeline and was like, write me right now. I was like, fine. And then my poetry editor DM'd me on Instagram. I was like, hey, have you ever considered writing a book of poetry? And I was like, no, I don't have time for that. I used to be a poet before I was a fiction writer, actually. My first writing workshop was at Cave Canem, and poetry was what I wrote from my teens throughout, until my late 20s. And then I had to figure out how to move into fiction. And I really wasn't planning to write a poetry collection, but then I started reading this other Nigerian poet, Romeo Oregun. I started reading his book, Sacrament of Bodies, and halfway through I closed it, and I opened the manuscript, and I was like, we're doing poetry. I love it. I'm in the mood for it. And then I started doing romance. Sorry, it's a lot of genres. I started doing romance because it was fun, and I wanted to write something that had joy in it, and that was going to have a happy ending. My literary fiction doesn't really fall into that at all. And fantasy feels like that as well. It feels like the genre in which everything is just a delight. It's a delight to read it as I'm writing it. It feels like I'm getting to explore this world for the first time, which I am, because I can't outline my books. It's a random craft thing. I used to do it before, and I would get stuck. And then Daniel Jose Older was like, you are a Gemini. The reason why you are getting stuck in your books is because when you outline them, you know what's going to happen. And then you get bored because you're a Gemini. So stop outlining your books and just find out what happens as you write them. And then your little attention span will actually, stay with the books. So that's how it feels right now. It's fantasy is the most fun, and then romance, and then everything else.
Here, the question has to do with the levels of violence that are seen as necessary in the different value systems of the characters in Bitter on the part of oppressed people to reach their goals.
So, important context for how I write about violence in general is that I grew up mostly under military dictatorship. So, my childhood was, and I never really talked about it. I wrote about it in the memoir, but it wasn't really something I talked a lot because it felt sensationalist. Whereas for those who were actually living it, it was just very matter of fact. It was oh, you drive by a dead body on the way to school, or you drive to mass and there's a pile of dead bodies outside the hospital and you have to wind up the windows so you don't smell them. And it was just normal. And then I was telling this to someone as an adult, and they were like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? And part of it was, when you grow up in something like that, you come to understand a lot about governments. And I did a degree in public policy. I did a master's in public administration and nonprofit politics. NYU. And at some point in one of the classes, people were talking about stuff, and I had this realization. I was like, wait, there are Americans who think that their government cares about them? I was like, oh, I was like, that's interesting. You no wonder you're having a lot of feelings. Because I was like, I grew up understanding that the most you could hope for from a government was like disinterest. Like, hopefully they won't be actively trying to kill you. Hopefully you will just, die from neglect, because if they were actively trying to kill you, it would be much worse. And these power struggles and like the coups that were happening and things like that, it was like, you just kind of try to keep your head down and stay away from the violence that was happening on a state and like federal level. And it had never occurred to me to think that a government would care about you or that it was supposed to. I was like, no, it's clearly for a small select group of people to collect power and money, and that's it. And the rest of everyone is just trying not to get squished in the process. So because of that, a lot of how I think about things is framed in terms of violence, because there is always violence. And I had a conversation years ago with someone who was trying to ask, well, what is it like, coming from Nigeria where, the government is so violent, to hear? And I was like, no, we're honest, back home. I'm just like, the government is just like, oh yeah, no. Like, so they had like the NSARS thing a few years ago where the government gunned down a bunch of protesters, like turned off the cameras, killed the lights, and gunned down a bunch of protesters, and then spent months denying it. But in the aftermath of that, the president, who, interestingly, used to be a military dictator of the country in the 70s and just came back and was like, yeah, Democratic president now. And he essentially tweeted, and the sentiment of the tweet was, if you keep protesting, fuck around and find out. We will gun you down again. Like, it was just completely unrepentant. And I was like, I appreciate that straightforwardness, because it gives it's just very clear, And so when people have conversations about like the place for violence in these things, I'm like, but there is already violence. So to pretend that there isn't is one of, I guess, the effects or functions of like propaganda in general, which is like, this is not violent, we're not doing this. And there's just so much lying, when you have a president who is like heavily funding the police. And you're like, well, what do you think is going to happen? You are giving money for Black people to be murdered in the country. And so I wanted there to be that conversation in Bitter, because this is a question that comes up in terms of, what does justice look like? Is there violence involved in it? And it comes up in Pet as well, especially at the end, where you get to see what an angel's version of justice is, and it is not human necessarily, but I don't have an answer for it, because I think the point is the question. The point is, and this is a question that Bitter asks, is how far will you go for your liberation? Does it involve violence? What kind of violence? Where will you draw the line at violence? Does it matter who is enacting the violence? Does the violence that they are enacting on us justify any level of violence in retaliation, in return? Is it even retaliation if you're trying to get free? Like, I think these are all the questions that are kind of swirling up in this book.
Thank you. Yes. So I had a question about your writing process, because it sounds like your books are, well, I feel like all books are living, breathing documents, because we read, they come to life. So when it's time for you to write a book, and how do the characters come to you? How does that happen? And what's that process like for you for writing the stories?
It varies from book to book. So it's actually just very specific to the book. with Freshwater, because it's autobiographical, I just started at the beginning of my life and went in chronological order. And I had, all my journals. Some sections of the book are literally copied and pasted from journals and then edited. With Vivek, my process was very mathematical because I was on a scholarship that had like a word count deadline. So I set myself to like 2,500 words a day in 500-word chunks. And that was based in the Niger Wife community, which is foreign women married to Nigerian men. It's an actual organization that exists in Nigeria that was started in the 70s. My mother is a member, and that's the community I grew up in. And it was just like a really strange little like enclave where it's like, oh, you have aunties from the Philippines and Russia and Austria, and you're living in this tiny little commercial town in Nigeria, but you have all these different cultures. And I really wanted to write that world because it's just odd. Like, it's just an odd little world. A lot of the characters just come from me daydreaming. Like, I have a really good imagination, mostly because I spent most of my childhood dissociating heavily from everything. And I was either in a book or I was daydreaming to create, like, story worlds for myself. And I think my favorite time to daydream is like right before you fall asleep. We talked about this at the Brooklyn Museum, and Nick Stone has an actual term for it. She calls it dream storming. And I was like, oh, this is wonderful. And so there's this time where, reality is more liminal and the worlds kind of blur together. So a lot of the time I spend in writing books isn't actually like typing. It's just daydreaming, like straight up like fantasizing. Like, okay, well, we're in this world and what's happening. And I'm one of those people who I don't have an internal monologue. Like, this was this whole thing that was happening on social media where they were like, people either have an internal monologue or they don't. And people were like, wait, you don't have a voice narrating everything in your head? And I was like, no. Not at all. I just see pictures constantly. So everything is running like a movie in my head. So when I daydream, I can see the visuals of it play out. And then when I write, I have to transcribe the movie that was in my head and try and capture. And that's, I think, a big part of why my writing has so many like senses involved in it in a way, because I'm trying to capture the feeling of being there, like, and just like very logical questions, I think, of what can you see, what can you hear, what can you taste, what do you feel, all these like sensations. I think that really is a huge part of my process and of my craft, and how my books end up the way they are. It's one thing to say, I'm in a room, versus I'm in a room with the white cracking over the walls and there's water dripping from the ceiling and a small gray patch on the floor. And, you see all those little things, and to put those little details in there. But because the characters are so alive in my head, I try my best to make sure that they stay, alive on the page as well. Can I repeat the question?
It was a big question, and I think one that I'm sure you get, because there is a source of curiosity, I think, for a lot of people. The question had to do with you consciously and very publicly identifying as Spirit First and embracing the term Ogbanje. I'm sorry.
Yeah, good job.
Oh, okay. And how that influences your work and also just your life in general.
So I think the first thing is that I don't identify as anything. I just am the thing. And I think that's an important shift for our language, is the language of identify versus just to be the thing. It's similar to like the language around like preferred pronouns versus they're not preferred, they are the pronouns. And for me, it was something that I didn't know about myself until I wrote Freshwater. And it's something that has been challenging to talk about publicly because there's so much translation required, and there's so much lost in the translation. And at some point in my career, I was like, okay, fine. I will just, let the translation happen, because there are certain spaces in which I'm not translating, such as specifically the books. So in Freshwater and in Dear Sender, and I was like, okay, this is me being able to talk about it, without translation. And when I was writing Freshwater, before I even started writing Freshwater, which I did not want to write, because there had been this whole spiritual process of being called to do certain work. And I had been resisting it, because I was like, please. I was like, I'm already queer, I'm divorced, all these things. I was like, I don't want to become a traditionalist, practicing our traditional religion. I was like, I just don't have the energy for that. And I kept getting called to it anyway. My first book was actually going to be a novel about an underground sex party scene in Lagos.
Where is it?
With Riverhead, still coming out. It is the next book coming out with Riverhead.
Okay.
It's called Little Rot. It's been written 4 years at this point. It's literally just sitting on a shelf, waiting for me to do edits. And it was supposed, I'm so sorry, but it was supposed to come out next year, and I pushed it because I was like, it's too many books right now. I was like, 9 books in 5. I was like, people are not even catching up to all the books. I was like, let me take a break, and and it'll come out in 2024 if we are all lucky. But that was the book I was going to write first. And I was like, this is a wonderful debut. It would have done so well as a first book. I was like, it would have been, they were like, oh my God, this is scandalous, and Lagos, and it's got this pastor as the villain. And I was like, it would be so controversial. I love it. And I was like, I could just write that book. Totally. I don't have to write a weird spiritual book. I don't have to do that. And I talked to this other Nigerian writer, Enuma Okoro, and I was telling her, we were at the Kimbilio Fellowship, and I was telling her, I'm not sure that... No, actually, we were at Callaloo. We were having lunch, and I was telling her, I'm not sure which book I should write. And she said, write the book that you're afraid. That you're afraid of writing. And I was like, okay. And that was Freshwater. So before I even started writing Freshwater, first thing I did was I went back home. And I just started talking to people. And it had been this thing that was... It was like a tracing of my name. So Akwaeke literally translates to Python's egg. That is not the translation that my father gave me. And he's the one who picked the names for everyone. He very much was like, no, it means precious. And I was like, okay, bet. And so when I found out, when I was like, okay, no, but this actually means Python's egg. And I started asking, I was like, well, why is a Python's egg precious? Why is it considered precious? And it's one of those things where, people have tried to change the story of the name to suit Christianity a little more. When I was supposed to be baptized or christened, they actually would not let my family baptize me with that name. They were like, you have to put a Christian name in there. So my middle name is Zara, which my mother was like, oh, some English royalty. And my father was like, Chizara, which is God answered. And that's the name that's on my christening paperwork. And that's the name that the church accepted. And Akwaeke means Python's egg, and it's precious because the python is the physical manifestation of the Igbo deity Allah. It is considered taboo for Igbo people to kill the python because it is literally her physical avatar. And a python's egg is considered precious because it is Allah's child. And I was in a market in Lagos a few years back. This trader were buying fabric from him. And he was Igbo, and he asked my name, and I said Akwaeke, and he was like, that's a name. And my driver was Yoruba, and the driver was like, wait, what does it mean? And this guy gave the best translation for the name ever. I put it in the book because it was so good. And he was like, Akwaeke, you can't find it. And if you find it, you can't touch it. And I was like, excellent. Yes, totally that name. And so I had felt this like specific calling because when I looked at both my names, and again, I had a huge problem with, for context, I'd had a huge problem with being alive my entire life. Was not a fan of it. Was really, really struggling with something about being alive. When I started writing Freshwater, I had these journals from when I was like still living in Nigeria. And it was just so much like pain. And it was like, I want to go home. And I didn't understand it because I was already home at that time. I was literally living in the same house and the same streets I'd lived in since I was a baby. Like, it didn't really make sense. And then I was raised really, Christian. I had gone through all of that. I had gone through I'd been in therapy. I'd gone through like the psychoanalysis. None of that explained or helped anything. It wasn't until I started looking at my life through the lens of Igbo ontology that finally things started snapping into place. And one of my best friends is Anne Daramola, who is a writer and a thinker, and she talks about this concept of different kinds of truths, how you recognize truths. Science, for example, requires truth as verification, like truth by verification. You have to verify the truth. When you're moving spirit first, it's truth by revelation, that which you know that you have no way of knowing, but you know it anyway. And that's, I think, that concept kind of distills why it was so hard for me to talk about things spirit first, because so much of the world moves by verification. So they want proof. How do you prove that you are what you are? And I'm like, our indigenous ontologies don't work like that. It is truth by revelation. And then you get into the questions of who is allowed to have revelation? Who is permitted to have revelation? Is revelation only granted to certain spiritual authority figures? And, the common person isn't allowed to have access to that. So in figuring out what I was, a lot of it was truth by revelation. It was putting the names together and just having, and I started it by writing like flash fiction pieces, prose poems. And it was like, okay, if my father asked God for a child, and then a child arrived, and he named that child the child of a specific deity, then I was like, that is who answered your prayer. You were given this child. They said, well, Beth, you want a child? Here's mine. And I had been making paintings. I'd been doing just a lot of like spiritual work around why I felt this need to go home. And home, it was very clear, did not exist in this realm. It was like you need to die in order to go home. With Obanje, it turns out that you have a cohort on the spirit side. Obanje are never alone. And your contract in this world is that you are supposed to die and go home and return to the other side. So it was like all these pieces and thinking about all these things. And I was like, I know I need to write about it. And this was like the genesis of Freshwater. But before I felt comfortable enough to do it, the summer before I started writing it, I went back home to Nigeria and I spoke to like other Nigerian people who engaged in like our indigenous faith traditions. And everyone said the same thing. They were like, continue doing what you're doing, because if you are being called back, then you are being called back for a reason. The calling is accurate. Your job is to obey it. And that was very affirming for me, because at that time I was terrified. I was like, what is happening? Like, what are these concepts? Like, my entire sense of self is being challenged, and it's linking to like these indigenous realities that I wasn't raised in because colonialism. So, with Freshwater, one of the things I talk about a lot is the work of Malidoma Somé, who recently passed. He's a writer from Burkina Faso. And in his book, Of the Water and Spirit, one of the things he talks about is that when we think of being colonization, you think of, okay, a language was taken away, a culture was taken away, religion was taken away. And what Somé points out is that reality itself was taken away. Things that were real for centuries, millennia, generations before white people showed up and said, this is not real. This is superstition. Our reality is the only valid one. And they replaced reality. So in my work and with my own, which is like really intricately tied to myself, it was to reclaim reality and understand that there was nothing about our indigenous realities that is less valid just because we were told so. And what does it look like to move from the center of these indigenous realities and say, this is just as valid as any other reality out there. This is not superstition. This is not, a ploy for anything. Like, this is just life as it was for our people since, the beginning of our people, up until, which is relatively recently in the last, however many decades or centuries or whatever, which is just a blip in the larger timeline. So I did all that work. I talked to a lot of people and I was like, okay, I'm going to start doing this. And I started writing Freshwater, and it was brutal. Like, I had so many breakdowns because I was reshaping my entire understanding of my life, of myself. And there were many things I knew that I had no way of knowing. So, for example, in Freshwater, there's this thing called the Iuwa, which is like a bridge between this world and the spirit world. And traditionally with Obanje, it's buried. If you want an Obanje to live instead of dying young, you get like a dibia, who's like a fate doctor, and they dig it up, they destroy it. In Freshwater, I was like, oh, mine is not separate. It is disseminated within my body. And then after I wrote that, I was reading a lot of like texts about Igbo ontology, and I found a text and they were like, sometimes the Iuwa is not buried, it is within the flesh of the Obanje. And I was like, okay. So it was like many, 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 many things like that. And it was this particular confluence of being an Obanje and also being the child of this deity who is, represented by a snake. I interviewed my parents for it. And there were, again, these little things that, if you're going truth by verification, people would be like, well, that means nothing. I'm like, sure, to you, in your context. I interviewed my mother and asked her about my childhood. She had no idea what I was writing. And she was like, yeah. She was like, when you were a baby, you did this whole thing where you were just like moving like a snake on the floor. And she's like, I called your grandmother. And I was like, the child is moving like a snake. And like won't use like her hands and feet. It's just like wriggling on her belly like a snake. She was like, it was very particular. And I was like, thank you, putting that in the book. And so over time, I've come to learn more about myself. I've come to, you can read more about, I could go on about this literally indefinitely, but that's why I wrote Dear Senderan. So I got to kind of talk more extensively about that. But I knew that one of the first things that was going to happen when Freshwater came out was that the veracity was going to be challenged by other Igbo people specifically. What I did not anticipate, which I should have, was that because I'm not cis and because I'm not straight, I would immediately, like, no one would want to listen to me from, like, unless it was other people like me. But I was so proud of myself, like, as a Nigerian, as an Igbo entity, for writing a book that put our ontology, like, right there on the main stage, that was going into this, that was bringing our realities into a contemporary context, because to me, this is really important work. Most people, like, we tend to think of these realities as static, in that they are frozen in time in the moments that we were discovered, by white people. And I'm like, that's not how realities work. They continue. We are not defined by this gaze, and like everything is stuck in that moment. And I was like, I'm writing all this stuff. It's in a contemporary context. It's like all of this. And I know that, globally, Igbo people, like, we're so proud of our culture, and people are really interested, like, we're really interested in our cosmology. There are multiple, like, theses written about Igbo cosmology, Igbo ontology. And I was like, yes, I was so excited to like be in conversation with like everyone about it. And then Freshwater came out, and then I disclosed that I wasn't cis. And then it became, well, you're faking it. Like, you're lying for the West. Like, you know that white people will love this shit, and so you're like doing this whole thing to like gain popularity. And it was incredibly hurtful, because I was like, oh, but if I was like a cishet man writing about this stuff, you would hail me as the next greatest Nigerian thinker. Like, and I was like, and I just wanted to talk to like our people about these things from a lived experience. And instead, I learned a lot about the ways in which like our thinking has been influenced by being colonized. For example, the taxonomy of our spiritual realities, to where it's kind of like the DSM, where it's like, okay, to be an Obanje, you have to be diagnosed by someone else. And you have to fit these diagnostic criteria. And if you don't fit these diagnostic criteria, then you're faking it. And I'm like, this is a gaze upon us. This is a way people are trying to understand our realities. That's not how, we did it. And even if it is how we did it, it doesn't mean that it was right. Because who are you to tell someone what they are? And that's something I write about as well, this idea that to look at myself and say that I am this thing, to be a non-human thing pointing at myself, takes away power from humans who want to do the pointing themselves and say, you are only what we say you are. And then if you say, well, I am this thing, and it really doesn't matter whether you say it or not, then it upsets like the preferred power dynamic. So what I fell back on at the end of the day was that this is a spirit first thing. If you don't move spirit first, it's not going to make sense to you. And that's okay, because we don't have to be in, the same realities. And if anyone, especially our own people, especially my own people, to come and challenge and say that, you are not who you say you are in terms of the child of the deity and this and that. I'm like, I don't have to trot out my particulars to prove anything. I'm like, if you really think I'm not what I say I am, you know what? Go to the shrine and take it up with the deity herself. That is the only authority in all of this. So go take it up spiritually, take it up spirit first. Go try and come at me on that level, because that is the only level that is real. And yeah, I'll stop there. Are you from New York even?
Hi. I'll just repeat the whole part. But I'm really fascinated about how you treat reality, what's real, what's considered unreal across all your work. And I'm wondering over time if that kind of world bending, the kind of making plural worlds real all at once has gone easier with time in the publishing world and publicly.
I don't know if it's gotten easier necessarily, because with each step of my career, everything changes so fast, and everything kind of balloons up. With each book, it's like a different set of challenges. A lot of the stuff is things that I can't quite anticipate. I did an interview with this a proper old school sit down face-to-face interview, one of those deep dives with this Swedish journalist a week or two ago, and he was asking me about what had happened with the Women's Prize for Fiction and being nominated for a Women's Prize. And so we ended up talking about gender and award culture and things like that. And I was telling him how my experience with being harassed very much for being trans, and watching at that time it was UK press and UK media really come down hard, and watching the institution that put me in that position just kind of back off. And the strategy of it, even as much as I do strategy, it also helps me to see how other people's strategies are working. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you longlist a trans writer, for me, I was hoping that that nomination meant that they were expanding their own practice, because the Women's Prize was created in response to the Booker Prize excluding women for like years and years. And so the Women's Prize was like, all right, we'll make our own. And my thing was like, okay, so you've made your own, but you're also excluding other people. So my hope was that they were expanding to be like, we realized we were not the only ones who were being pushed out. And so we're making our space more expansive to include other people. That's not what was happening. And I was like, okay, in that case, nominating me was transphobic, because that is a space that you decided I should not be in. So why did you put me there? And to longlist me and then get, like the props for like, oh my God, the first like NB trans person nominated for it. And all that means for me is a slew of violence directed against me from due to an institution that is not interested in protecting me whatsoever. And in that moment, I was like, there is no way I am going to get shortlisted for this, because it is one thing to get your little diversity points in a long list, but when the media attention is that, like, there was so much of it, and it wasn't about the work. And like, it's great for them to like create buzz over a long list, but then to escalate it with a short listing, and I was like, they're not going to do that. It's bad PR for them, quite honestly. It's better to just be like, we got this with a long list. Okay, now go away. Let's get back to business. Let's get back to shortlisting the people that we actually, made this for. And then that was with Freshwater. And then when Vivek came out, there was a question about whether to nominate me again. And I was like, well, are y'all expanding or what? Like, answer the question. And then they emailed to ask for like legal proof of my sex. And I was like, you are transphobic as hell. And I will never have my work submitted to you again. And then they longlisted a white trans woman. And I'm just like, oh, you're so smart. This is brilliant strategy, because then, again, you get the diversity points. You get the, we're inclusive points. And everything you did to the black trans person is just swept under, because it's like, well, of course we're not transphobic. We longlisted, a trans person, a white trans person. All these things are messy. But when the Women's Prize thing happened, I was especially upset about it. At that time, I was still very invested in award culture. Being nominated for the Booker Prize, winning the Booker Prize was like a goal of mine. And when that happened, with the amount of UK like brouhaha that was going on, I was like, I am not getting nominated for the Booker, because they don't want that smoke. Like, it's like, no, it's a lot of controversy that is, unsavory. So that was like the moments where I was like, oh, a lot of this has nothing to do with my work. It doesn't. And that was when I had to start kind of making the decisions about what was real, what mattered, what didn't. And I found out that I had to start letting go of things. And then, last year when, there's a whole transphobic thing spearheaded by She Who Shall Not Be Named. And there were thousands of Nigerian, homophobes and transphobes just attacking me online, and then it hit right-wing people, and then I had to worry about being doxxed, because I was like, this has now hit right-wing media, and now my assistants at home are trying to figure out, I'm like, we got to watch what packages we're opening. Now my safety is being compromised simply because I pointed out that someone who was transphobic was transphobic. And then to watch that and watch so much of the literary world stay silent, watch the literary institutions stay silent, watch Black literary institutions award this person, and that's when I divested from all of that, because I was like, if you are not interested in keeping the most vulnerable people among you safe, then to me, you're not real. I'm not going to place anything in you. And from the outside or from a certain distance, it's very obvious. Obviously institutions are compromised. But as someone who was a baby writer who had, looked up to these things for so long, it's been a slow process of kind of stepping back and realizing that, there are costs, again, to not being silent about things, to calling out people in power, to not just being, I'm so grateful to be here and thank you so much for, giving me a career kind of thing. So that's really how I've done it, like professionally, really, is to change my censors and realize that my censors are, radical, they're black, they're queer, they're trans, and these are the people I'm writing for, and these are the people who matter, and to essentially be like, I do not want a seat at that table, at that other table. I used to, and I realized that the people at that table would watch me die without blinking, and I'm not going to waste any more of my time seeking to become part of their reality. I'm going to focus on the people that I'm in service to, and that, I think, has become my compass.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I ran really long with my answers.
See, but these were the answers that we wanted. Well, thank you so much for reading and for answering our questions. We're going to go into a signing portion, and I think we should make that transition kind of quickly. We're going to move some things around, and then the signing will be on the stage. So just hang tight in the interim.
BRB.